A Trip into the Darkness. Chapter 15. The internal tug yanked on Mallory again, pulling her from her thoughts. She needed to get out of this house. She would have time to reminisce when she wasn't in the middle of a hornet's nest. Standing up, she made her way back to the door so she could exit Troy's office. Pressing her ear against the wooden barrier, she listened. She didn't hear anything, smell anything, or feel anything. Releasing a deep breath she hadn't realized she was holding, she prepared herself to leave. Turning the knob, she slipped out the door and moved back to the grand room. The question of what to do next struck her. She needed to figure out a way to get out of this mansion, which had been her prison. Mallory thought about trying to climb out the window. Her body was stronger now, so she should be able to survive the fall. She walked back over to the row of windows and looked out the one that was above the line of cars, staring down. There was a tree directly below it that she could try jumping into. She had only ever climbed a tree a couple of times in her life because growing up she was in cities and towns. There was one time when she was much younger they had lived in a house with a wooded area behind them. During the year they lived in that house, she and her brother went out to the woods and would climb trees together. He was always much better at climbing than her, but he had been older after all. Lance had loved to climb to the very top and taunt her. She had also fallen out of a couple of trees, but she would not think about that right now. It was because of his teasing that she had taken risks that resulted in breaking her wrist. To this day, Lance would tease her about what a horrible tree climber she was. Glancing out the window, she could not see the guards from this far off, but she had a gut feeling that they would notice her as soon as she jumped. She needed a distraction so they wouldn't spot her making a break for it. Chewing on her bottom lip, an idea struck. She reached into the pocket under her black sweatshirt and pulled out Hulk's butane lighter. She pressed the button down and blue flames shot out the end. A smile tugged at her lips. This would show that psychopath Troy that he had kidnapped the wrong girl. She wished she could see set his entire mansion on fire and stand back to watch it burn. Mallory walked back to the grand staircase and saw the plush rug with a couple of couches and a little table in front of the stairwell. Starting with the couch, she bent down and set it on fire. In a matter of seconds, it took off like a little flame, a little inferno. She thought about trying to light the rug on fire too, but after a minute, the rug took off without her having to waste any more of the butane. It was perfect. Backing away from the flames, the little room became engulfed. Turning around, she ran to the window and slid it open. She heard shouts outside that were quickly moving into the mansion. Sticking her head out the window, she didn't see the guards anymore. Well, this is it, she thought as she looked down at the tree. Fuck me, she whispered as she took a breath and climbed out the window to jump. It took all her willpower not to scream on the fall. When branches started hitting her in the face and other parts of the body, she let out a squeak and grabbed at them. She was able to catch herself on one of the last branches before hitting the ground. Her body was screaming in pain all over as she held on for a couple of seconds while she tried to catch her breath. Letting go, she hit the ground with a thud. Groaning, she wondered if it would have been less painful to simply just jump out of the window and trust her luck. With shaking hands, she pulled out Hulk's keys and pressed the unlock button. A couple of cars down, she saw the lights of a black SUV flash. Limping to the vehicle, Mallory pulled on the handle. It opened with no problem, and she hopped in and then put the key in the ignition. It dawned on her then that she hadn't driven a car since she was 18 and living with her brother. He had owned a small pickup and would sometimes let her borrow it when she wanted to get out of the house. It's like riding a bike, Mallory. You never forget, she whispered as she turned the vehicle on and put it in reverse. Pressing on the gas, the tank of a car shot backwards. She slammed on the brakes before putting it into drive. Jamming her foot on the gas again, the SUV shot forward and slammed into the car that it was beside. Shit, she growled as she continued to press the gas and pushed the smaller car out of her way. Once the SUV was going in the right direction, she sped down the asphalt drive toward the gates that she had spied on earlier. By the time she reached them, the SUV was already going 70. She saw a man stick his head out of the little station house beside the gates, but she didn't care. She was going to ram it and hope for the best. If only Hulk's SUV was a Dodge. Her brother's favorite joke about Dodge Ram pickups was, if you can't dodge it, you ram it. With that thought, she hit the iron gates, and the airbag slammed her in the face. Even with the impact, she didn't ease up on the gas. Opening her mouth, she sank her aching teeth into the fabric. The bag went down, and she felt relief when she could see where she was going again. It was a long driveway, probably a couple miles in length if she were to guess. When she finally came up to a road ahead, she let off the accelerator. The sun was glaring through the windshield and making her eyes water and sting. Squinting her eyes, she wondered which direction to take. Left or right, she whispered and felt a slight tug on the wheel pulling leftward, so that's the direction she went. Before she turned on the two-lane road, she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw flames emitting into the sky from the mansion she had just escaped. She let out a deep breath of relief when she didn't see anyone speeding down the driveway chasing after her. Once on the blacktop, she sped up to 60. Mallory wanted to go much faster, but she feared a cop might try to pull over. Troy likely had control of the law enforcement in this area, judging by his wealth and social status. Then there'd be the issue of license and registration and why she was driving a wrecked and stolen vehicle. After a few miles, multiple fire trucks screamed past her with their lights and sirens on. Mallory pulled the hood of her sweatshirt over her head, hoping it would help conceal her face and keep the sun off her burning skin. She knew she needed to ditch Hulk's car before someone realized she was missing or the guard at the guardhouse informed Troy a woman had broken through his gates. It wouldn't take long for them to be on the hunt. Pulling up to a four-way traffic light, which was just turning red, she slammed on the brakes. She put the SUV into park and jumped out. Spotting a red Mustang sitting at the light ahead of her, she moved towards it. Looking inside, she saw a young man with black hair and a pair of sunglasses resting on his face, sitting in the driver's seat. Moving to the passenger's side, she opened the door and got in. "Hey, what the hell, meh?" He broke off mid-sentence when he saw her. Staring into his eyes, she said, "Just drive and pretend I'm not here." He nodded like he was in a trance and looked back at the road. When the light turned green, he started to accelerate down the old country road that was slowly becoming more populated with houses and other cars. Mallory could feel his weak energy dancing around her. She could also smell his blood, which wasn't anything exciting. A throb started in her head, and her skin began to itch from the sunlight hitting her face. While the guy drove, he kept reaching down and touching himself while risking glance at her. She watched as his breathing accelerated and his cheeks became flushed. She could all but taste his arousal, and it made her feel nauseated. "Pull over now," she told him, and the guy immediately hit the shoulder and stopped the car. Jumping out of the vehicle, she went around to the driver's seat. The guy just sat there, waiting for her next direction. When she opened the door, he had the audacity to smile at her like she was coming to drum his bones or something. "Get out," she growled, and like the fool he was, he climbed out of the car and stood there smiling. With a shove, Mallory pushed him out of her way before getting into the driver's seat. "Give me your sunglasses," she told him, and with a slight nod, he took them off of his head and handed them to her. Mallory took the offered gift, slipped them on her face. Almost immediately, her headache receded. Slamming the door shut, she put the car back in drive and drove away from the guy who was still standing there smiling. What a creep, Mallory thought as she started speeding through the suburbs. It didn't take her long to realize she was coming into Toledo. "I lived this close to a monster for almost 6 years," Mallory said to herself as she shook her head in disbelief. Troy could have stumbled upon her at any time, and neither of them had a clue. Goosebumps rose on her arms. No wonder her mother had been so anal about moving around all the time. She wondered if her mom had known the extent of the beasts that resided in this world. She desperately wanted to go back to her apartment since she was this close, but she would not make that mistake again. When she was forced to stop at another red light, she wondered where she should go. She had escaped, but now what? She couldn't go to her brother's because what if Troy and his minions were able to track her somehow and she brought them right to him? She obviously couldn't go back to her apartment. She had thought about the countless other places she had lived in her life. She had loved the short time they had lived in Florida. Perhaps she would head down there and spend the rest of her days lounging on a beach. That actually sounded really nice to be on a beach and close to the ocean. Looking at the dashboard, she typed in Miami, Florida on the Mustang's GPS and pressed enter. When the light turned green, she started driving while the GPS calculated the best route. When it finished loading, she found she was 1,324 miles away, and if she drove non-stop, she could be there in just 18 short hours and 20 minutes. It was perfect. Glancing down at the fuel gauge, she found it was over half full. She would have to stop before long to get more gas. Glancing around the car, she looked for a stash of money, but did not find anything of value. Mallory had been hoping that guy would have been nice enough to have forgotten his wallet in the car. Oh well, she would figure that out when the time came. After passing through a few more lights and a stop sign, a cop pulled up behind her and turned on his lights. Shit, numbnuts must have realized I stole his car, Mallory mumbled as she contemplated trying to outrun the cop. She decided against it as she pulled over to the side of the road to wait. Running from a local Toledo police officer would have caused a scene, which would have made it easier for Troy to track her. Surely he had realized by now that she had escaped. As the officer sat behind her with his lights on, Mallory ran through all the possibilities in her head. She didn't have a doubt in her mind that the cop would try and arrest her. I could probably kill him fairly easily, she thought as her mouth continued to throb and her throat ached from the dryness. She had a feeling that she was much stronger than the average human, and the idea of getting more blood sounded amazing. She remembered the smell of Numbnut's blood, and her nose crinkled. Not appetizing, but she wouldn't turn it down if it would save her from going to jail, where she would be easy access for Troy to come along and collect. Thinking about him touching her again caused a spike of fear to go through her. He'd be angry when he realized what she did. She knew he would try tracking her down, considering how many times he had felt the need to inform her that she belonged to him. He wasn't the kind of man to just let someone like her walk out of his life. The thought of what he would do to her when he had her back in his possession caused her hands to start shaking as she clutched the steering wheel. Once he was done abusing and punishing her for escaping and setting his mansion on fire, he would likely leave her tied up and chained in that little room for the rest of her immortal life. She would rather die than live through that. The cop got out of his car and started walking her way. Mallory braced herself to go for his throat. He stopped at the open window and was just opening his mouth to speak when he looked at her in the eye and froze. Minutes passed while he stood there speechless. Impatience bubbled up inside of her as she waited. She did not have time to just sit here on the side of the road. "Are you going to speak?" "Yes, ma'am," he said breathlessly. Mallory could feel the energy rolling off his stiff body. His aura felt different and stronger than the Mustang guy's energy. It was somehow fuller and comforting. His blood also smelled more appetizing. Grinding her aching teeth, she thought about driving away, but the officer would likely break out of the weird trance and call her in. In fact, he had already likely reported her to the station, which meant this car would be on the radar. Damn it. "Let's go back to your car and talk. What do you say?" she asked him. She knew it was a risk getting in the police car, but the prospect of tearing out his throat was still an option if he wised up and tried to arrest her. A dark, small part of her hoped that he would. "Yes, let's do that," the cop said as he opened the Mustang door for her. Getting out, she turned and walked back to the passenger door of the cop car. Opening it, she got in, waited. The officer stood in front of the car for a minute before he decided to get into the driver's seat. Once the door was closed, he turned and looked at her. "This is fucking weird," she thought as he just stared at her like a lost puppy. "Why did you pull me over?" "Because that car was reported as stolen." "Did you call this into your station or whatever?" "Yes." "Well, tell whoever you need to that you were wrong and it wasn't the right car," she told him, expecting it to be an easy fix, until he said, "I already ran the plates and they matched with the car that was stolen." "Okay, listen, bud, I'm not going to jail, so you need to fix this so we can move on with our lives." Mallory growled at him and flashed her fangs. The cop leaned away from him and gasped for breath. She was afraid she had broken the trance until he said, "I could take you somewhere safe." Not exactly what she wanted, but it was a start. She needed a new car and to figure out a way to ditch the cop. "Fine, take me to the mall on the outskirts of town." Nodding, he pulled the police car away from the curb and started driving. Someone on the radio asked what was going on and to report back on the Mustang. Instead of answering, he reached out and turned off the radio. While they drove, he kept turning his head and looking at her. At least he wasn't touching himself inappropriately like the last guy. 20 minutes later, they pulled into the mall's parking lot where he found a spot and parked. Mallory went to open the door so she could get out, but he grabbed her hand, stopping her retreat. A wave of his lust and longing hit her. "Please take me with you. I'll do anything," he begged. She glanced at the wedding band on his left hand and felt guilt creep into her conscience as she thought again about going for his throat. Licking her parched lips, she said, "Just forget you ever saw me." Climbing out, she closed the door and the cop car slowly pulled away from her. What the fuck did Troy do to me? She thought as she looked around the crowded parking lot. She briefly remembered the first time she had met him and how, when he touched her, she was overcome with the unbearable need to do anything and everything he said. However, he had had to touch her for that. These fuckers just looked at her, and fell to her will. It was a nice skill to have in her situation, yes, but still creepy and unnerving. As she started to glance inside cars, looking for one that had the keys in it, she realized how dry her throat was. Her mouth was aching. She needed more blood, and there were so many people walking around. They were literally everywhere. She needed to get out of here fast before she lost her grip on reality and started attacking innocent people. When a woman who appeared in her late 20s pulled up beside her in a black Jeep and rolled down her window, Mallory braced herself for the worst. "Hey there, you want a ride?" The young woman was pretty. She had short brown hair that had blue streaks in it. Her skin was darker, like she spent tons of time in the sun, and she was wearing a black halter-top dress. Glancing at her hands, Mallory noticed she had a ton of different rings on every finger, and at least 4 different necklaces wrapped around her throat. This girl looks like she could be a blast in Florida, Mallory thought as she nodded at the woman before going to the passenger side. Once inside, Mallory closed the door and looked at her. The girl smiled before saying, "Hi, I'm Katie." Mallory raised her eyebrows as she felt the woman's energy start seeping into her. It felt light and sensual. It reminded her of a light, warm breeze blowing off Lake Michigan during early July. The woman's blood smelled sweet, even if it was a far cry from the blood Troy had shared with her. Licking her dry lips, Mallory replied, "Hi, Katie. I'm Mallory. Do you want to go to Florida with me?" Katie squealed with excitement and clapped her hands together. "Oh my gosh, yes. I love Florida. What part do you want to go to? Do we have time to go to my house first so I can pack a few things?" "No, Katie, we don't have time. We must leave for there now. Right now. Do you have GPS on your phone?" "Sure do." Katie handed her phone to Mallory, still smiling like she had just won the lottery. Mallory took her phone and opened it to Maps to type in Miami, Florida. Once it was up and going, she put the phone on the phone holder located on the dash so Katie could see the way. When Katie continued to sit there, staring and smiling, Mallory cleared her parched throat and said, "Let's go." Nodding enthusiastically, Katie put the Jeep into drive and started following her GPS. This is not good, Mallory thought as she watched the vein in the woman's neck move with the beat of her heart. "I should have taken numbnuts to Florida," she mumbled as she fought against her bloodlust, which was now yelling at her to attack poor Katie.